Okay, so we talked about the politics of public administration, which dealt with the different aspects such as federalism and the politics and PA and that type of thing, dichotomy. So now we're going on to the management part of it. And so actually public administration, we call this governance, governance, which is basically saying, all right, we are a public agency, we deliver services. We deliver services based on the legislation that was passed for a particular program, and we deliver it within a political context. Okay, having said that, when you talk about public administration or when you talk about delivering services, delivering programs, there's parts that you need to know about and there's theories that you need to know about. And so this is how to manage people, how to manage resources within a public setting. So these are some of the things that we're going to be talking about. For the public sector, we're going to go through a timeline of what public administration has looked like uh, within, this context. It's Woodrow Wilson, where administration is administration. So it's gone through different iterations of what public administration is. So what we're going to be looking at is we're going to be looking at why organizations exist. What are some of the advantages and disadvantages of large organizations? To what extent should work life provide well-being? And how should this be accomplished? Now, you might say these are kind of odd learning outcomes, but basically it's this. We spend a lot of time working. And so what happens within an organization and within an organizational culture is going to uh, help us do better within our life, or it may lead to a toxic work environment. And there are implications for both of those. More than anything else, it's like, how should you treat your workers? To what extent should you empower your workers, or how should you treat them in order to get them to be more productive? Okay, so basically organizations exist because organizations exist to respond to policy problems through the implementation of programs. When we talked about the politics of public administration, what I told you at that time is that a public agency exists only because a law was passed. And the law was passed in order to provide some kind of services, and you do that through a program. Okay, so it's to respond to policy problems, and the organization, a public agency, is the entity, the institution that gets the work done. So in this evolution of the theory of organization, or the evolution of public organization and organizational theory has spread out in many ways from the Woodrow Wilson, the politics administration dichotomy, where administration is administration, there should be no politics, to what it is today, learning communities, being able to adapt and to situational management. So let's go through some of these in detail. We're going to be covering the principles of management, this human relations school, quality, what is quality work? So if you look at it through a timeline, and there's work on one axis and the orientation of how we perceived this governance aspect of public administration. From the 1920s, it was very much control oriented, very much efficiency was a value that was being promoted. And so it's gone through this timeline where in the 2000s, which is kind of where we are now, we have like a different type of mindset of what a particular public agency should be and should be doing, and how they should be treating their workers. So what we're looking at here is the creativity and quality as opposed to the control and efficiency. So let's start with the principles of public management. If you look at them, 1900s, and as I said, this was kind of like a follow-up to Woodrow Wilson's essay about the public administration dichotomy. And so the public administration or the management models at that time followed that particular model. Administration is administration. And what they were saying at that time is that the key to maximize productivity and output, again, maximize productivity and output, is what's going to be the most essential value that public administrators should promote. And had the greatest direct impact on the theories of public administration at that time. And so because it was set up that way, We talked about Max Weber, and I'm going to be going through some of the Weber stuff again of this ideal type of bureaucracy, and that's why I introduced it to you in the first place. But what it was a critique. He was saying, well, the way that these public administration agencies are set up, it's a form of social dominance over the workers in order to control them and to get them to do what they need. And as he was studying these organizations, he came up with different tenets of this particular ideal type of bureaucracy. His essay was saying the legitimacy of bureaucracy is established in order for it to be an authority figure. And this legal authority is based on the rules and regulations that are written based on the legislation that was passed for this program. It's going to be enforced by those who hold the power. That's legal authority. And traditional authority is basically saying, well, we have had importance and enduring traditions. And so when you take these two things together, it gives bureaucracy a lot of authority on what can be done or not done within a particular program. This is another way of saying bureaucracies have the power of the state behind them. Another element of the ideal bureaucracy is called charismatic authority. And there's this thing called charisma, and we're going to talk more about charisma when we talk about leadership. But basically it says that you have some type of, or a worker has some type of emotional attachment to a specific individual. And so that particular individual is able to garner more productivity because you're willing to follow the leader. In other words, you're willing to be a follower to that leader that has this charismatic authority. Hierarchy is another one. We're going to be doing a section on organizational structure and organizational design. And so what Weber was saying at that time, he was saying, you know what, the way that bureaucracies can be most effective and most productive, and this is where public agencies just really caught on to this thing called hierarchy or chain of command. It's based on the legal authority of the bureaucratic administrative staff. So it's the law is passed, there's rules and regulations that are written within a program, and then the directives come down to the street level bureaucrats, and that's the way that they attain this thing called legal authority. Another characteristic is that they are organized in a clearly defined hierarchy of offices. And so you can say, well, what exactly is that? Well, if you've ever had to deal with any kind of hierarchical structure or any type of bureaucracy, you should know that there's many different departments. And so they are organized in a way that there's going to be lower level employees, mid-management employees, managers, directors, generals, whatever. So it's clearly defined within that hierarchy. And again, we'll talk about more about that when I talk about organizational structure. More importantly, this is a big advantage of public bureaucracies is that when these people are hired to work in bureaucracies, they're hired based on merit. And what that means is that they have the education, they have the skills, they have the abilities, they have the experience to work in a particular agency. So that's considered to be a sphere of competence in the legal sense. I have this job because I have the qualifications to meet this job. I have the merit to have this, to take this position. It also says that whatever office you may hold, and that means that you're an employee, that you take this position because you want to, not because you are forced to. So it's filled by free and contractual relationships. There's free selections. You know, back in the olden days, it used to be uh, a good, well, let me put it to you this way, a good job was one that was that you worked for the government. It wasn't until the 1980s where it was more like, no, you need to work for the private sector, but it was like a privilege to be able to work for the government. Okay, so they're saying these candidates are going to be based on technical qualifications. This is what I was saying a while ago. The exams, the licenses, the diplomas, and you are given the compensation for this. You are given benefits for this. You are remunerated by fixed salaries and a right to pension. Basically saying you get benefits. Most of the time, public agencies may not pay as much as the private sector, but you get benefits. So you have like a trade-off in that way. Usually, whatever job you hold in the public sector, you hold only that job. It's your primary occupation. Now, I'm not saying that you cannot have like a side gig. You can, but you have to get it approved. Otherwise, it might be considered to be a conflict of interest. But it should be your sole or the primary occupation that you have. And so when it comes to the public sector, a lot of people like working in the public sector because they say, you know what, I can build a career out of this particular public sector. You know, when I don't know if I've ever told you this or not, but when I first started working way back in the olden days, I started working for the state of Texas, and I started working in food stamps, which is considered to be like the armpit of the state. But you kind of work your way up. You know, you have to work so many months there until you get tenure. Then you can apply for other jobs, and you can apply for other jobs. So I kind of like kept escalating and going up and getting management positions and stuff like that. So that's what it's saying. You can build a career based on whatever education that you might have and whatever experience you might have. I think this is another way of saying do not expect to start at the top. Very few people start at the top when it comes to public agencies, and it's usually some kind of a political appointment. All right, let's get to the scientific management theory then. There was this one guy, he was a psychologist. His name was Frederick Taylor, industrial psychologist. And so what he wanted to do, he said, you know what, I think that I want to study a group of people, and because what I want to do is I want to see to what extent we can consider management to be a science. And the way that he wanted to do this is to try to have some type of control in the work environment. And so he came up with these principles of management by doing these studies, time and motion studies, that type of thing. And he says we need to develop a way that we can evaluate how people are going to maximize productivity, how they're going to do things in a rational way. And this time it was rationality is basically what's best for me, but in this particular sense, it's what's best for my employer. Efficiency, how many of these widgets can we put out within a given period of time, a day or a week or whatever the time period is going to be, and how much money are we going to get out of this? So this was not exactly public sector, this was private sector, but the public sector adopted this model that was basically for the private sector, was set up to be in the private sector. So you can see that it didn't exactly fit, but this is kind of what it was doing. Okay, still talking about Frederick Taylor and the type of rationality and efficiency model. It was private sector factory work that he was looking at. And so what he was doing, he was saying, okay, what we need to do is that we need to figure out what these people are doing, how they're doing it, and those are called time and motion studies. And in these time and motion studies, these workers are getting paid by the piecework. And the piecework basically means that they were getting paid by the number of pieces that they were actually recording or where they're actually producing. So it was an efficiency model, a productivity model. And so what Frederick Taylor can be remembered as more than anything else is that in order to do this assembly-like work, the most efficient way of getting things done is through assembly line, is through specialization, and what he termed as the one best way. That there's one best way to do things to get people to produce the most they possibly can. So some of the problems with this model, though, is that it had high human costs because people were really looked at as machines. You know, it was like you were just producing, you were a machine, and so it ignored the fact that the workers' concerns are not always the same as management's concerns. But in this model, the management, the factory, the business was the one that took precedent. The next group of theorists that were writing about the scientific method of doing things was White and Gulick, and they came up with this idea or this framework of how organizations work and what it is that they do in organizations, and they termed it POSCORB. That's a mouthful, isn't it? They're saying we're looking at organizations and we see that they do special things. If you're in an organization, you will do planning, you will do organizing, you will do staffing. In addition, you will do directing, you will do coordinating, you will do reporting, and you will do budgeting, which is where the initials came from for POSCorp. So you take all of these things and you say, if you're a good manager, you should know how to do each of these things and do it well in order to be a good manager. Of course, again, this had high human costs, and so another group of theorists came and they said, well, we think that maybe the scientific school of management may be focusing too much on the efficiency and the productivity, and so they said they really are just ignoring the human factor of the work organization, of the organizational structure. And they said they thought it was important to study it because they said humans are the ones that are working, and in order to have humans produce, you have to kind of pay attention to what they're doing. So they conducted these things called the Hawthorne experiments. And the Hawthorne experiments were basically dealt with lighting. They increased the lighting, they decreased the lighting. They wanted to see, kind of push the buttons of where workers are going to be more productive. And so they did this based on gender. So they said, we want to see if female workers work in different circumstances than male workers. And so some of the results of these studies were that one, female workers, didn't matter if they increase the lighting or if they decrease the lighting, the female workers said, if you pay attention to me, I will produce for you. For the male workers, their biggest thing was the control. They wanted to control the situation. They wanted to have information because information is power according to this particular model. And so they saw that there were differences in how maybe female workers should be treated and how male workers should be treated.